Hello and welcome back to our study of the Law of Moses. Last week we had a look at all of the laws pertaining to the protected classes. So the law recognizes that um, there are hierarchies in this world that put some people at a great disadvantage compared to others. And the law guarantees that, again, so long as we're obeying the law, those people should not be abandoned and neglected. So it puts in special protections for a particular set of classes, again, widows, orphans, sojourners, we talked about last week. And all of this is part of the law's agenda to combat poverty. Right, we saw how all of these protections, how a lot of them are ultimately economic protections. How the whole idea is to prevent people from falling into destitution, making sure that people have what they need. And it revolves around people giving of their own goods, their own property, to those who belong to the protected classes. So we looked at, we'll just sum everything up in the most radical of the laws, the universal grazing law. Basically, anybody who wanders through any field can eat from it. They can't harvest from it, meaning you can't start, you can't take a sickle in with you and start cutting down your neighbor's wheat or their oats or barley. And if you're going through a vineyard, you can't bring a sack with you and start, shoving grapes into the sack to take home for later. But no, as you're walking around, if you're passing through somebody's field and there's food there on the vine or on the stalk for you to eat, you can reach out and eat. That guarantees, that's part of just a whole host of guarantees that there should be ample food in the land to take care of those who cannot take care of themselves. That's the ideal. And this is all going back to a series of topics, a series of problems that the law addresses that, where you have somebody who has something happen to them, like a famine or death in the family or fill in the blank. Something happens, though, where they're not able to provide for themselves, so they get into debt to make ends meet, which, the way that things are structured in most ancient law codes, you can never get out of that debt. And so that makes things even harder, makes it even more likely for you to fall into destitution until ultimately that cycle lands you into slavery. And the law, as we have seen over the past several weeks, does a lot of things to break that cycle. At every step of that cycle, the law is combating that eventual outcome. So we've seen how all of those laws are laid out. This week, we're going to look at how the law gets played out in real life. We're going to look at an Old Testament example in the book of Ruth. And then we're going to see how the laws are carried forward into the way the early church acted and the way we are instructed to act in the New Testament. So let's begin with the story of Ruth. We're going to go to Ruth chapter 1, and we're going to begin in verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me that for your sake, that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. All right, so this begins the story of Ruth. And just right here at the outset, the way the whole story is framed, we can see so many of the problems that we've already looked at, things that, but we see the red flags going up. The whole thing starts off with a famine. And this man Elimelech has to leave Israel with his wife and his sons on account of famine. All right, this is something that the law is, again, supposed to try to equip people against. Now, again, there's only so much that you can do in the event of a famine. Right, but this is one of the reasons why people go destitute. And notice, by the way, how this famine immediately forces Elimelech and his family into a more difficult position. They go to a place where they have food, but now they are foreigners in the fields of Moab. And so they are sojourning in a foreign place. We know that that brings all kinds of perils with it, that foreigners are usually objects of abuse in antiquity, honestly, just as they are today. And then even more disaster strikes. In fact, this is a lot like reading the beginning of Job, where one disaster just follows another. And as they are living in the land of Moab as sojourners, as they are refugees from this famine in Israel, we should notice, by the way, I almost forgot to bring this up. There are some clear foreshadowings of the gospel here as they are departing from Bethlehem in Judah. And there's an irony in this too, because Bethlehem means house of bread, and they have to leave house of bread because there's a famine, and they flee to another country, just as Jesus, who was born in Bethlehem, has to flee to Egypt. But I mean, there's all kinds of layers to this story. But we notice, again, that even more disaster strikes because Elimelech dies. And now Naomi is left as a widow. So you have all of these things piling up. You have famine. Now Naomi is a foreigner. Now she is also a widow. And notice the way that in fact, let me get the slides queued back up here. I want you to notice the way that the story immediately changes its framing. Right, the story is it's full of surprises from the introduction. All right, so we'll go back to the first slide in Ruth chapter 1, starting in verse 1. We're not going to read the whole thing. But look, as you're looking at these first verses, it's centered on this man. A man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn. He and his wife, his 2 sons, the name of the man was Elimelech. It's all of this is given from the man's perspective, which is completely normal in Hebrew narrative, right? Normally it's men who take the center stage in stories in the Hebrew scriptures. And everything is described in reference to the man, because he's the patriarch. It's his wife, his 2 sons. He's the free agent here, as it were. And they go into the country of Moab, and they remain there. But then you notice, in the very next passage, Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died. Right? Notice the frame of reference there changes immediately. Right? It's now no longer Elimelech died. It's the husband of Naomi died. Now Naomi is the frame of reference. Right? Now things are starting to change, and it's because now suddenly Naomi has been left on her own with her sons. She was, well, yeah, the text just says that. She was left with her two sons. So these took wives, but then they both died as well. So that, notice the way that this closes at the end of the slide, the woman was left without her two sons and her husband. All right, so in all of this, again, the disaster of all of this is played up. And you have just one disaster piling up on top of another. And these are all things that bring to mind that poverty, that vicious cycle of poverty that we've talked about over the past few weeks. They bring to mind the protected classes. Right now, Naomi is a foreigner and a widow. So she is two of the three protected classes under the law of Moses. And for a while, we think maybe the story is going to be about her, until ultimately the story cues us in that it's going to shift its attention to these daughters-in-law. And then at the end reveals that it's ultimately going to be about Ruth. But I want us to note the way in which our attention is drawn to these daughters-in-law. There's something that Naomi says to Orpah and Ruth. All right, they try to travel home with Naomi, and Naomi tries to stop them and says, "No, each of you return to her mother's house." Now, that phrase should hit you like a brick in the face. Mother's house. Now, over the past couple of years, we've read a lot out of the Hebrew Scriptures as a church. How many times have you heard the phrase mother's house in the Hebrew Scriptures? It's practically unheard of. In fact, there's like one other place in Genesis that's used in an odd way that honestly I don't understand. Other than that, there are a couple of uses of it in Song of Songs, where it is used to kind of play up the erotic nature of their relationship. But apart from that, that phrase doesn't appear anywhere else in the Hebrew Scriptures. Instead, what we constantly have is father's house, right? Your whole identity as a Hebrew is tied to your father's house. Even in the numberings of like the census of Israel that we read of in Numbers, right? Everything is counted according to fathers' houses. That's the way that everything is set up in ancient Israel society. Everything is identified through fathers' houses. And yet here, Ruth and Orpah are encouraged to go back to their mother's houses. Now, we don't know explicitly, one way or the other, the state of their fathers, all right, whether their fathers were dead or alive. It's like Melchizedek, though. You know how the Hebrew writer tells us that Melchizedek, because he's not given a genealogy, he has neither father nor mother. He has no beginning of days nor end of days. Like, we know literally Melchizedek was born and he died at some point. Right, but the way the text presents him in Genesis, the Hebrew writer says it's like he has, again, no father or mother, no beginning or end of days. And here, the way that the text presents Ruth and Orpah, they are fatherless. They don't even have a father's house to go back to. They have to go back to their mother's house. And the text is cueing us in here that we should be thinking of Ruth as fatherless. So that Ruth, whenever she ultimately follows Naomi back to Judah, Now Ruth is all three of the protected classes at once. She is fatherless, because again, we read of no father, and she is told to go back to her mother's house. And remember, the Hebrew word, there's no Hebrew word for orphan. I think we talked about this last week. The Hebrew word is fatherless. Right? When we're talking about the widow and the orphan, we're talking about the widow and the fatherless. So biblically, she's described as an orphan, and she is a widow. And when she returns to Judah with Naomi, she is a foreigner, a sojourner. She is all three of the protected classes wrapped up in one person. In other words, she is the lowest possible person in ancient society. She is the most marginalized person imaginable in ancient society. Really, the only thing that could make her even more marginalized would be if she was a slave. And as we've seen from our studies so far, that's ultimately what she is destined to become if something doesn't change for her. She is either going to become a slave or she is going to become a prostitute, which essentially means she's going to be a sex slave. Right? She does not have a bright future, as we read in Ruth chapter 1. She is destined for that fate. She is going to be enslaved, and she's very likely going to be used. So, what hope does Ruth have? Well, we've seen what hope Ruth should have in the law of Moses, but we've also been told at the beginning of the story that this takes place during the time of the Judges. And if we've read Judges, we know that Ruth doesn't have a lot of hope, because as you read Judges, you find that practically no one actually keeps the law. In fact, we read that women like Ruth are literally raped to death and their bodies chopped to bits and sent all around Israel. Right? That's the kind of fate that befalls a woman like Ruth in the book of Judges, in the time of the Judges. And Ruth lives during that time. And so what's going to happen to her? Well, let's pick up our reading from a little later in Ruth chapter 1. We're going to skip down to verse 22, and we're going to see just what is done about Ruth's circumstance. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." All right, now, we should just stop and notice right here Ruth's concern that she should go to the field of someone in whose sight she could find favor. Now, we've read from the law. We should know that really shouldn't be a concern, right? The law leaves it open. You look at the context. They come home during the barley harvest, right? This is the time of year when the law guarantees them that there's supposed to be an edge left around the field for the poor to eat from, that the gleanings are supposed to be left behind, and that the fields, again, just generally are to be considered open to people like Ruth who need to go in and eat. And yet Ruth is concerned to find someone's field where she can find favor in that person's sight. Right? It's an indication that not is all as it should be in Israel. But let's pick our text back up. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem. And he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his young man, who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers.' So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest." Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter. Do not go out to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Then she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." And at mealtime Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? Where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, "The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." And Ruth the Moabite said, "Besides, he said to me, 'You shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest.'" And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted." So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother-in-law. All right, I know a lot of information to take in there, but as we've read that, considering all of the things that we read in the law, I want you to notice just how thoroughly Boaz has kept the law, and especially in what ways he has actually gone beyond what the law requires. That's going to be a really essential point in just a moment. But I want you to look at all of the protections that Boaz offers to Ruth. All right. First off, he gives her the right of gleaning, and in fact goes even beyond that. Right. So not only is she allowed to go through the field and glean after the reapers, but remember there towards the end, he specifically instructs his reapers, you go out and pull out some extra grain and actually leave that on the ground for her so that she has more to have. All right, so she's given the full gleaning rights. On top of that, while she is gleaning, she also has access to the workers' water. So if she wants to take a rest, she can take a rest. If she wants to get a drink, she can get a drink. Which in a place like Israel, and well, really anywhere in antiquity, water rights are important. And Boaz is being generous. He's not required to do that. Right? We don't find a place in the law where the law says you are required not only to let the poor glean in your field, but also to give them water as they work through the day. Nowhere does the law require that, but Boaz gives it. Boaz also gives her protection. And notice, by the way, that was a concern at the very beginning. Right? Ruth is looking for a place, a field belonging to someone in whose eyes she can find favor. And Boaz offers her that favor, right? He says to her, see, have I not told my young men not to touch you? And this concern is carried on even to the very end of the passage, right? What Naomi says, right? It's good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted. Right? Because that's just the reality of Israel as it was during the day of the judges. Like we've seen, it's not uncommon for women to be sexually assaulted in antiquity. And in fact, that's why there are so many laws about it. And Boaz does the due diligence to make sure that Ruth can exercise her gleaning rights without having to deal with someone trying to sexually assault her. And then on top of all of that, Boaz then invites Ruth to dinner and feeds her from his table and gives her extra food to send home to Naomi. Right? So in all of this, really the only thing out of all of that the law requires is for Boaz, not to rape her himself, and for him to give her gleaning rights. That's all that the law requires. But he goes so far above and beyond that in making sure that nobody else rapes her, in making sure that she has extra food, in making sure that that she is fed not out of the food that she gleans, but from his own table, that she has water, that she has all of these things. Right? This is the ideal that the Bible is setting up for us. So what I want us to understand from the law of Moses is that it is not giving us an ideal. The law is not giving us an ideal. Ruth gives us the ideal. Boaz is the ideal. What the law of Moses is giving us is entry level. That's the basement. That is the bare minimum for righteousness in regards to the poor, is that you make sure that they are fed and that you don't pervert justice against them. We are not just invited to meet the bare minimum and stop there. Instead, in the character of Boaz, we are invited to go above and beyond. We are invited to see the spirit of the law as well as the letter of the law, and to recognize, hey, if the law is requiring me to feed the poor out of my field, I really ought to feed them from my own table, too. If the law is requiring me not to go around, raping women that I find in my field, I really ought to make sure that none of my servants do that, too. And I mean, in all of these things that we see with Boaz, right? It's if the law requires, because look, like we said last week, the law doesn't specify how broad of an edge has to be left around the field. The law does not specify how thorough you can be in your harvesting. It just specifies that whatever you happen to leave behind, you can't make a second pass. If you're an Ebenezer Scrooge, you can just go through your field very slowly and very thoroughly the first time and make sure that there's really not anything left behind, or a rather minimal amount that you just grudgingly leave behind. The law doesn't specify one way or the other how much has to be left behind. Boaz takes it upon himself to say, well, however much my reapers would normally leave behind, let's leave behind a little more. And let's give Ruth access not just to the gleanings of the field, but also to the sheaves themselves, what has been harvested. She's going to get access to that. That's the kind of character that the Bible is inviting us to emulate, and not the sort that says, well, I've met my requirement by the law. I've done what I was supposed to. You can't force me to do more. I'm not going to do more. Excuse me. So, and this really, as I was considering things for this class, want you to consider kind of where Boaz fits in the whole scheme of Old Testament men. And I don't just mean in the line of the Messiah. He is in the line of the Messiah, by the way. He's in Jesus' genealogy. But I mean in the spiritual scheme of the men of the Old Testament. There are really very few men like Boaz. You've got some that come close. Maybe Samuel, maybe Job. They come close. Moses, as we've noted in our class, has an inauspicious beginning. Whenever God calls him, but he very quickly matures into a great man of God. There are a lot of people that we venerate from the Old Testament that don't merit nearly the sort of veneration that Boaz does. Like Abraham, I mean, he's the father of faith. He also pimped out his wife multiple times. David, he was the king that God chose, who also had a man murdered so he could steal his wife to add to his already harem-sized collection of wives, and then let his son get away with raping one of his daughters without doing anything about it, ultimately leading to a civil war in Israel. Right? But we lift up David as a great man, and in a lot of ways he was a great man. I mean, he's the author of the Psalms. But there are few men that compare to Boaz. Moses wrote the law, but Boaz kept the law. And that's something special. We don't see a lot of men in the Old Testament actually keeping the law. I mean, there are a lot that we just don't see keeping the law at all. There are very, very few that we see keeping the law as well as Boaz does. And so in the way that we consider the poor, the way that we think of our obligations to take care of those who are marginalized in society, we ought to look to examples like Boaz. And it's appropriate because Boaz is set up as a type of Christ, right? I mean, he comes from Bethlehem as well. And you have this woman who is the lowest of the low, the neediest of the needy, the most marginalized person imaginable under the law of Moses. And Boaz comes and delivers her, protects her, and ultimately, we'll study this more in other topics as we go through the law of Moses. We'll finish Ruth later, but we'll see ultimately that Boaz redeems Ruth. All right, we get real big gospel vibes out of the book of Ruth. And so Boaz is the guy that we ought to be looking to, one of the guys that we ought to be looking to as we consider our own obligations to the poor and how we ought to treat them, how the law is applied. So, with our time this week, I also want us to see how these laws translate forward into the New Testament. And I want us to begin by considering an attitude that I have found in more than one place in the churches. Excuse me, it's not an isolated thing that I have found. This is just in my experience, but it has been a pretty broad experience, and I've seen these kinds of opinions expressed not just in the church, but also online. There's a very wide array of Christians that once you start talking about our obligations to the poor, and especially if you were to start talking about combating poverty itself, not just helping poor people, but also trying to put systems in place to combat poverty more broadly. There is one saying of Jesus Christ that almost immediately comes to the forefront. It's John 12:8. We find it also quoted in the other Gospels. But we're gonna read from John this time. John 12:8. For the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me. Right? So there it is. There's always going to be poor people. So it's useless to even try to do anything to keep people from being poor. Now, that ignores absolutely everything that we have read from the law of Moses for like the last 3 weeks. And it ignores the context of John 12:8. Jesus is not just, this is one of the worst examples of proof texting that I think there is in the churches of Christ today. And again, I hear this coming from a lot of people. The poor you'll always have with you, right? There's no sense in trying to combat poverty overall as a thing, because the poor you'll always have with you. Let's start first off by putting John 12:8 back in its context, and then we're going to see, based on that context, where Jesus is coming from, what he's alluding to out of the law, right? Because this conversation that Jesus is engaged in has a basis in the law. And I want us to notice something that happens in the law that completely repudiates this false interpretation of what Jesus says, the poor you'll always have with you. And then from there, I want us to see how a correct interpretation of what Jesus says, a correct understanding of how the law applies even in the church today, is actually carried forward into the early church. How the church fulfilled the law in a way that Israel never did, in a way that you only see men like Boaz doing in the Old Testament. It actually became a full institutional thing in the early church. Let's not get too far ahead of ourselves, though. Let's return to John chapter 12, and we're going to put this in context. Let's see where we're going to start here. We're going to start in verse 1 of chapter 12. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at table. Mary therefore took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard, and anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, he who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, and having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Jesus said, "Leave her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me." All right. Putting that statement in context, I think should help us to understand what Jesus is getting at here. First off, notice that it is Judas's alleged concern to give this the proceeds from this nard to the poor. So why wasn't this sold for 300 denarii? In other words, he could sell this practically a year's wages. What's being used on Jesus here, and given to the poor. Why didn't you do that, Judas said. And John fills in for us an essential detail. Judas doesn't care about the poor. Judas is treasurer of their little group. He's the one who keeps the money bag, and he likes to pilfer from it. Right? He skims off the top, as it were. What Judas is concerned about is Judas. He's not really interested in seeing those 300 denarii going to the poor. He's interested in seeing a bit of that action for himself. And that is why Jesus responds to Judas the way that he does. And we should notice is that Jesus is responding to Judas. He is not laying out some eternal principle for all of his followers for time immemorial. When he says, "Leave her alone so that she may keep it for the day of my burial, for the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me," he is addressing Judas, because ultimately he knows Judas's heart. And there is a reason based in the law why Jesus says, the poor you always have with you. Now, we're going to ask ourselves a couple of questions. First off, where have we heard that phrase before? Because we've actually read it within the past week from the law of Moses. The poor you always have with you. It might be the past couple of weeks. Yeah, I think it was a couple of weeks ago we read it. We've read in the law, the poor you will always have with you. This is based in the law, what Jesus is saying. And he's saying it for a particular reason. In what sense is it true relative to Judas, the poor you always have with you? Well, let's turn our attention to the law and see where this is coming from. We're going to go to Deuteronomy chapter 15, and we're going to read the first 11 verses. So let's turn there. At the end of every 7 years, you shall grant a release. All right, so you remember this. This is the Sabbath year law. And this is the manner of the release. Every creditor shall release what he has lent to his neighbor. He shall not exact it of his neighbor, his brother, because the Lord's release has been proclaimed. Of a foreigner you may exact it, but whatever of yours is with your brother, your hand shall release. But there will be no poor among you, for the Lord will bless you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance to possess, if only you will strictly obey the voice of the Lord your God, being careful to do all this commandment that I command you today. Now, I want us to stop for a second and note that the law of Moses has just explicitly said the opposite of what Jesus just said to Judas. And we'll make sense of this in just a minute. But the law says, there will be no poor among you. And the reason is this: the Lord will bless you in the land that he's giving you for an inheritance to possess. But that promise is contingent on something. There will be no poor among you if only you will strictly obey the voice of the Lord your God, being careful to do all this commandment that I command you today. It's contingent. You will have no poor among you if you'll do what God says. Oh, what has God said? We've just read that over the past couple of weeks. You do things like you grant a release. You lend expecting nothing in return. You keep your fields open. You provide what people need. If those who are rich provide for those who are poor, there will be no poor. Right? If you do what the Lord your God has told you to do, there will be no poor, God says. That's the reading of the law. Let's return, though, to Deuteronomy 15, because we're not done there. This is not the last word. For the Lord your God will bless you, as he has promised you, and you shall lend to many nations, but you shall not borrow. You shall rule over many nations, but they shall not rule over you. If among you one of your brothers should become poor, if in any of your towns within your land that the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart or shut your hand against your poor brother, but you shall open your hand to him and lend him sufficient for his need, whatever it may be. Take care lest there be an unworthy thought in your heart, and you say, the 7th year, the year of release, is near. And your eye look grudgingly on your poor brother, and you give him nothing, and he cry to the Lord against you, and you be guilty of sin. You shall give to him freely, and your heart shall not be grudging when you give it to him, because for this the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in all that you undertake, for there will never cease to be poor in the land. Therefore I command you, you shall open wide your hand to your brother, to the needy and to the poor in your land. All right, now that adds another layer to things, because now we've just reached the point in the law that Jesus is almost directly quoting from. So what's the reason? Why is Jesus telling Judas specifically, the poor you will always have with you? It's because of the spirit of Judas. It's entirely consistent with what we just read in the law. There will be no needy among you, the law says, if you will do what the Lord your God commands. And Judas has demonstrated that he is not willing to do what the Lord commands. He's a thief, and he steals from the poor. Right? He's trying to use the poor as a front. Right? He's using charity as an excuse to get money into the treasury so that he can pilfer from it. He's absolutely shameless. Right? And this is before he has made his betrayal. He is already this kind of low sort. And so, according to what the law has told us, it's attitudes like Judas's that will ensure that there are people who are going without, that there are people who are needy. But I want us to consider, though, the law itself says there will never cease to be poor in the land. Right? And this is right after, by the way, a circumstance where it says, if your brother becomes poor in the land, don't hold back, don't give to him grudgingly, but open your hand to him. So the law tells us there will be circumstances in Israel where there are poor people. And then the law says there will never cease to be poor in the land. Just like Jesus has said, the poor you will always have with you. But it is said that right on the heels of having said, there will be no poor among you if you will follow the voice of the Lord your God. What does that mean? Well, it means a couple of things. First off, it means, again, what we just saw in Judas's case. It means that the sinful and wicked attitude that, I'm just not going to take care of the poor. I'm going to keep what's mine. Or I'm going to take what even doesn't belong to me. Those kinds of attitudes guarantee the existence of poverty. Right now, at this point, we might still be might still be motivated to just kind of throw our hands up and say, "Oh, yeah, there's nothing we can do about sin. There's nothing we can do about wicked people. There's always going to be poor people." That's not the example that we find in the church, by the way. Not in the early church. Maybe in our church. Not in the early church. The early church didn't throw its hands up and say, and by the way, when I say our church, I don't mean our local congregation here. I think we do actually pretty well in what we do. What I mean is the modern church writ large. Anywhere that you find this attitude that says, we shouldn't even bother. Right, that is the attitude itself that guarantees that there will be poor in the land. So that's one sense in which it's intelligible for the law to say there will be no poor in the land if you will follow what God says, and there will never cease to be poor in the land. Right, it's an indication that there will always be sin. That is one sense in which we should understand that passage. Another sense in which we should understand it, I think, is made clearer in a similar situation that we find in the early church. We're trying to resolve this tension between the law saying there will be no needy among you, there will be no poor among you, and at the same time there will never cease to be poor. All right, there's another way that tension is resolved that we read about beginning in Acts chapter 4. So let's start in verse 34 and 35. There was not a needy person among them. All right, very first line, right out of the gate. Luke tells us in the early church, there was not a needy person among them. Just like the law, almost right out of the gate, said, there will be no poor among you. Right, now let's see where things develop from that in Acts. There was not a needy person among them, for as many as were owners of lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold and laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as any had need. All right, right there in the passage, we are told, just right there at the end of the passage, that there were some in the congregation who had need. So wait a minute, Luke just told us that there was not a needy person among them. That's right, because the needs were met. Right, it's explicitly what Luke says. There wasn't a needy person among them because as many as were owners of lands or houses, that is the rich in the church, sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold and laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as any had need. There was no needy among them because they took care of the needs. Right? That doesn't mean that there ceased to be needs. It means that the needs were met. And in fact, we find that played out again in Acts, as there's a lot of conflict actually that builds up around this. Right? We've got the infamous case of Ananias and Sapphira in Acts chapter 5, who on account of this, a failure to adequately supply to the poor and to try to lie to God about how much they are contributing, they're struck dead. Right? On the heels of that, continuing this conflict about how needs are met and how the distribution is made, we read this at the beginning of Acts chapter 6. I think we're going to start in verse 1. Now in these days, when the disciples were increasing in number, a complaint by the Hellenists arose against the Hebrews because their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution. And the 12 summoned the full number of the disciples and said, "It is not right that we should give up preaching the word of God to serve tables. Therefore, brothers, pick out from among you 7 men of good repute, full of the Spirit and of wisdom, whom we will appoint to this duty. But we will devote ourselves to prayer and to the ministry of the word." And what they said pleased the whole gathering. And they chose Stephen, a man full of faith and of the Holy Spirit, and Philip, and Prochorus, and Nicanor, and Timon, and Parmenas, and Nicolaus, a proselyte of Antioch. These they set before the apostles, and they prayed and laid their hands on them. Now, Luke has earlier told us that there were no needy people among them, and yet here, just immediately after that, we are told that there were widows among them who were receiving from the daily distribution. When the scriptures tell us that there were no needy among the early church, or that there should be no poor in Israel, they're not saying that there will cease to be poor people. They're not saying that the people will stop having needs. What they're saying is that if you do what God says, those needs are going to be taken care of. That's precisely what we find happening in the early church. We find it happening in Acts 4, when the rich of the land are, when the rich of the church are selling their lands and their houses, and they are giving the money to the church to be distributed to those who have need. We find it in Acts 6 when a formal system is put in place to ensure that distribution is made equitably and that everybody who has needs are getting those needs met. That's the way that we square that circle. That's the way that we should understand that tension in Deuteronomy chapter 15 when Moses says, "There will be no poor among you." And then he turns right around and he says, "You will never cease to have poor in the land." That's what he means. That there's always going to be somebody who's needy. There's always going to be widows. There's always going to be orphans. There's always going to be sojourners. There's always going to be poor people. But they don't have to be destitute. If only you'll do what God says. If you will obey the law. If you will be like Boaz, if you will feed those who need feeding, if you will give them to drink when they are thirsty, if you'll put clothes on their back, they don't have to be destitute. And what condemns us about it is that those who are destitute, that is a conscious choice, and it's not just their conscious choice. Right? The existence of poverty, the existence of destitution is a choice. That's what the law, that's what Acts testifies to us. It is a choice that we make, whether we are going to allow there to be poor, or whether we're not going to allow there to be poor. Excuse me. Right, it is absolutely a priority for us today. Like all of the stuff that we have been studying in the law of Moses about how you take care of the poor, it's not just some throwaway thing. It's not something that got nailed to the cross, as it were. It's something that, again, you look at the way that the church is fulfilling its obligations. You'd never find Israel fulfilling its obligations in those ways, being that thorough in the way that it handles things. In all Israel, you find the one guy, Boaz, who exemplifies what the law is asking, what God demands of us, what he invites us to strive for. Only Boaz. And yet in the church, you find the whole church in Jerusalem participating in this. You find the whole church as an institution assigning... we frequently call these guys in Acts chapter 6 the proto-deacons, because this is really the beginning of the diaconate in the churches of Christ. These guys are early deacons. And the institution, the office of deacon, is established for the express purpose that the institution of the church can distribute to those who have need, so that it can continue to be true what Luke said earlier, that there was no one needy among them. It's something that still continues for us today. Right? We are still obligated. In fact, the New Testament continues to pick up the language of the Old Testament in talking about the protected classes. Right? Look at, maybe the most famous passage regarding this is James chapter 1, verse 26. If anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. Religion that's pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Right, so again, the New Testament doesn't just pick up the same content, the same general teaching. It picks up even exactly the same language, talking about widows and orphans and taking care of them in their affliction. This is something that absolutely should be a priority for us today. This is not something like the dietary laws that just kind of disappears. This is something that, we could take a grand tour of the New Testament and see how this is on practically every page. Remember the one thing in Galatians, whenever Paul is recounting his meeting with the authorities of the church in Jerusalem, the one thing that they are concerned with, after he makes his report, after he talks about his teaching the gospel to the Gentiles, the only question they have is, are you taking care of the poor? And Paul says, yeah, that's the thing that I'm most eager to do, is take care of the poor. It is absolutely an obligation for us today. So now, one of the common objections that we find to this sort of thing, we find all kinds of objections thrown around, right? It's going to make people lazy, or that you're going to bankrupt yourself helping poor people, which is absurd. Right? You're not going to bankrupt yourself giving somebody something to eat. You're not going to bankrupt yourself making sure that people have the things that they need. We should also note, though, going back to what we have seen, what we've seen in the law, what we've seen in Ruth, and what we see elsewhere in the New Testament, is that there are, I don't want to say limitations placed on it so much as guidelines placed on it. This is, in other words, our obligation to care for the poor and to guarantee protections for those who are marginalized among us. We are told to offer those protections prudentially. In other words, we're told to use our heads, basically. I want us to consider in particular what Paul writes in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 3. Let's go there. Honor widows who are truly widows. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household, and to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God, and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. Command these things as well, so that they may be without reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband, having a reputation for good works. If she has brought up children, has shown hospitality, has washed the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted, has devoted herself to every good work. But refuse to enroll younger widows, for when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry, and so incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith. Besides that, they learn to be idlers, going about from house to house, and not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander. For some have already strayed after Satan. If any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows. Right. So, in other words, the law includes these kinds of litmus tests, as it were. Right. We are supposed to use our heads with this. Right. We're not supposed to think, well, if we start taking care of poor people, we're going to start, there's somebody going to cheat us. There's somebody going to pull one over on us. What we're obligated to do, again, is use our heads. We shouldn't treat this like some kind of slippery slope thing, right? Where if we have one member come to us, he's gonna, and we give him some kind of money, he's gonna turn into a leech or something. I mean, that's, again, Paul accounts for that kind of thing, right? You look back at Ruth. Ruth's not laying around all day while Boaz is providing her the food. She's going out and she's working hard for it, right? We're all held to account. That's not what the scripture is trying to say here, that we don't require things of people, that we don't hold people to account, that we don't use our judgment. What the scriptures are telling us, though, is that it is easy to make excuses. It's easy to tell lies. It's easy to be lazy. It is the easiest thing on earth to ignore the poor. It is the easiest thing on earth to look around and say, oh, you know what? I might be rich, but this is fine. Any kind of inequality between me and, brother so-and-so who, can't even afford barely afford a place to live, can't afford any means to get around and take care of himself or whatever. It's not really fine. So I feel like there's, here at the end, let me just say I acknowledge that this is the kind of thing where I tend to climb up on the soapbox. And if you have felt soapboxed today, I say on the one hand, I apologize for that, and on the other hand, get over it. The church needs to hear the word of God. And in the American churches in particular, I think this is something that we can't preach hard enough. Right? There's all kinds of problems that need to be preached down. But the love of money and neglecting the poor, this is, in American churches today, this is about as big as it gets. There's it's like that and sexual immorality. Those are like the big two, at least as I see it. So I hope that this study has been edifying. Again, this is something, I think I said this a couple of weeks ago, that this is something where I'll tell on myself here. I used to be one of those the poor you'll always have with you types. I'll admit full out, while I'm confessing to things, I might as well just confess, man, I was a registered libertarian almost my entire adult life up until like a year ago. Um, yeah, no, I had abandoned a lot of those libertarian beliefs further back, but I started adulthood with pretty much the full range of libertarian values, including the general belief about the poor that mostly people get what they deserve, especially in a free country like ours, and that if somebody wants to not be poor, they should just simply stop being irresponsible. Stop being poor. What's the matter with you? Um, and looking back, I mean, that sounds like a caricature, but I'm judging myself on this, and I'm judging others that I have talked to and that I have known. I honestly think that's a fair way to represent a pretty broad range of broadly right-wing libertarian values in this country. There's a huge, huge libertarian wing among the conservative movement in the United States. That's the big split in the Republican Party, is between actual conservatives and libertarians. And it was honestly, I don't know if I could really tell you at what point my eyes really started being opened against that. This idea that people generally get what they deserve and people are generally only poor because they've made irresponsible choices and they deserve it, and we should not do anything about it, and it's useless to even try because there's always going to be poor people. But the more and more of the scriptures you see, I think the more and more that's just not a tenable position to hold. The scriptures repudiate that view at practically every turn. The law and the way that the early church is set up, it's all structured to do away with any of that. I mean, first off, that vicious cycle of poverty that we were talking about in antiquity, but even just the very concept of inequality, we find the early church holding all things in common. So that just is what it is, and I hope that studying through this has been useful to you. I hope that it has been edifying, and I hope, again, that all believers who hear the word of God on this are converted in their hearts, to understand that we really are obligated in a very radical way to care for the poorest among us. So, next week, oh, you know what? I didn't print the schedule out, and I haven't looked at the schedule. Next week, we'll talk about the law of Moses some more. I'll just say that. Not sure what the topic will be. Possibly, we might be moving on to violent crimes, because we need to do that before we talk about the Redeemer. Remember, Boaz is described as a Redeemer, and that's actually a pretty big role in the law of Moses. We'll talk about what that means. It includes some of the things that Boaz does later in the book of Ruth, and that's where we'll bring Ruth back in. But it also includes some other things having to do particularly with the way that violent crimes are punished. So we'll talk about violent crimes first, then we'll talk about the Goel, the Redeemer, at some point. And of course, there might be something between now and then. I don't know. We'll look at the schedule. I'll see you next week, and until then, take care. Bye-bye.